Hey people, welcome to Accidental Gods, to the podcast where we still believe that another world is possible, and that if we all work together, there is time to create the future that we would be proud to leave to the generations that come after us. I'm Amanda Scott, your host in this journey into possibility, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome Chris Smaje back to the podcast. When we last spoke in the spring, in episode 166, we explored his book, A Small Farm Future, what it meant, how he came to write it, and what a small farm future might actually look and feel like. And while we were talking, we veered tangentially onto the topic of the Eco-Modernist agenda, and in particular, their embrace of precision fermentation as a means of feeding the world's population, largely, as far as I can tell, so that they can dispense with farming, which they don't like, and so they can make a lot of money out of selling us protein brewed in a stainless steel vat. Chris said then that he was writing something that would address this more directly, and he suggested he come back when it was ready. And now it is ready, and he has come back to talk about his new book, Saying No to a Farm-Free Future, the case for an ecological food system and against manufactured food. I was extremely glad to get an advanced reading copy and to read it through several times. It's brilliant. I love this book. It does exactly what it says on the tin, and it does it well. Chris has a background in academia, and his capacity for critical thinking shines through all of his writing, on his blog, in his previous books, and in this one. And what he does with this is he examines the good and the bad of the Eco-Modernist agenda, and in particular, the new kid on the Eco-Modernist block, George Monbiot, and his latest tract, Regenesis. Because Regenesis isn't all complete nonsense. The taking apart of industrial farming is really very good, and Chris is much kinder than I tend to be at giving credit where credit is due. And then he uses his critical thinking, and he really dives deeply into the assertions that are made by all of the eco-modernists, and particular in Regenesis. He takes them apart, he looks at the numbers, and he shows the rather large number of places where they really don't stack up. He looks at the alternatives. He looks at how we might live not in an eco-modernist world. And at the end, he makes a heartfelt, grounded, and I think rather beautiful plea for us to rediscover our human place as a good keystone species, instead of feeling we have to wall ourselves up in urban jungles, in concrete boxes, eating manufactured food grown in stainless steel vats. You can tell, I don't think this is a good thing. So this was a meeting of minds and hearts, and I really enjoyed it, and I hope you do too. People of the podcast, please welcome Chris Smaje, author of Saying No to a Farm-Free Future. Chris, welcome back to the Accidental Gods podcast. It's a delight to speak to you again and to have a copy of your new book in my hand. It'll be out shortly after this goes live. So it's called Saying No to a Farm-Free Future. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're saying no to, how it arose, and then how you came to write a book that explains an alternative viewpoint?
Right. Well, very nice to be on the podcast again, Amanda. Yeah. So the book, it arose really as a critique of a movement known as Eco-Modernism, and specifically one of the latest books in that genre to talk about the food system, George Monbiot's book, Regenesis. So in a nutshell, the idea of eco-modernism is that, we're the inheritors of the legacy of modernism, where we're talking about a modern, high energy, high capital, urban existence, the sort of familiar story of economic growth and development that was, I guess, originated in Europe and foisted on the rest of the world in one way or another. And obviously that's led to all sorts of problems, climate change, economic problems, biodiversity loss. Wherever you look, really, there's a kind of problem caused by this kind of high energy, high capital urban way of life. And the eco-modernists, it's kind of a sort of accelerationist kind of, we've backed ourselves into this corner, and the only way out is up, or only way is to further accentuate all those trends, but to try and do it in a way that solves the problems that have been created. So typically, I think there's kind of four key elements to eco-modernism. One is energy transition. We need to have a lot of energy, but it can't be fossil fuels. So, it tends to be, historically, it tends to be very much a pro-nuclear mode of thinking. I mean, maybe renewables, but, low carbon energy, but nevertheless high energy input. It tends to focus on biotech in the food system. So, a lot of the original stuff was around GMOs. And now, of course, we're talking about so-called precision fermentation and manufactured food. So a lot of my new book is basically critiquing the arguments around the latest biotech elements. The third thing is urbanism. As the figure that's often bandied around is that now the planet is more urban than rural, more people living in towns and cities than the countryside. And so the argument is that, that's a kind of baked in trend. We are a city species now, and we have to embrace that. And I guess kind of related to that is a focus on rewilding, that human activities are causing devastation to wildlife and nature. And the best thing we can do is extricate humanity from wild places, live in cities, minimize our impact, and let nature do its own thing. That's the kind of basic eco-modernist package.
So before we look into that proposal, specifically looking at food production, land use, and the things that you're specifically interested in, can we take a slightly wider look at eco-modernism? Because it feels like it's been generated by people who live in cities, have no connection to anything that lives outside of a concrete box, probably grew up playing computer games. And as Simon Michaud has said a lot on this podcast, are completely untethered to any kind of logistical reality. And yet, they seem not to be necessarily stupid people. Some of them write as if they are incredibly bright. And I haven't unpicked this in great depth, and I think you have. Do you have a sense of the world that they are trying to build? Are they genuinely wanting us all to live in concrete boxes with VR headsets on, existing in the metaverse, and eating everything that's been produced in stainless steel vats? And if they are, what is humanity when we do that? What is their vision for humanity? Or is it just that they hate humanity so much they want to corral us all into small spaces, and then the rest of the world will be free of the kind of plague of Homo sapiens?
Well, there's a lot of things wrapped up in that question. I mean, I would say conversely, a lot of them argue that they love humanity and that it's the traditional Greens that kind of hate humanity and sort of want to get rid of, urban civilization and all the rest of it. But what I would say is, I mean, they are very smart, a lot of these people, but one of the problems with being smart is that you can use your smartness in different ways. You can accept certain parameters and then, drill down deeply within those parameters without seeing the bigger picture. And I think there is a lack of seeing the bigger picture, except in as much as I think some of them would argue, look, we're in so deep in the mire, we've got to do things so quickly that the only way out is more of the same. But that's where I think they're making a really catastrophic error. But I think it's interesting the way you frame it in terms of the sort of urban dystopia. My feeling is that there's a kind of utopian aspect, which is sort of like, living on a campus in a lovely city like Seattle, say. I've spent a bit of time in Seattle many years ago. Right. I mean, it's you can have a nice life there. There's some lovely buildings. You can be on the university and the campus thinking great thoughts, and then you can sort of hike off into the mountains and sort of enjoy nature as a spectator. And so I think that is the utopia that they sort of want for humanity.
Wow.
But I think the reality is more, as you say, there's a kind of dystopian direction it's going to go in, which is cheap manufactured food for the poor, corralling people. It's going to be, it's kind of a logic of enclosure for the remaining rural population. I mean, maybe we can come on to that in more detail because there are some sort of interesting complexities there. But I think it's very much that kind of policy wonkery, solving problems top down, somebody with their sort of sat at their computer solving the problems of the world for everybody else. And we've talked before about philanthrocapitalism. It's very much the sort of Bill Gates mentality that leave it to really smart, rich, clever people like me. And, I've got all the solutions and everyone needs to just listen to me because I'm smart and I've got financial backing. And I think, that is a really, really deep problem with it. It is implicitly or explicitly a kind of a form of colonialism and a sort of top-down solutionism, which is going to be foisted on people in really quite problematic ways.
Yes, I love the word solutionism. It also seems to me that it completely blinkers itself to all of the externalities except for carbon. There's this, we've got to produce energy. We've got to have exactly the same amount of energy. However we produce it is magical thinking of technology that doesn't exist yet. And we're going to solve this one problem that we have perceived and hyped, and we can argue whether it's true or not later, that livestock are bad because methane. And having got our heads around that and decided that a plant-based diet is the answer without looking at any of the externalities of the plant-based diet, we're then going to fix that one problem and everything else will then be fine. And there's no systemic thinking there. There's not even the slightest bit of let's look at the whole picture, which just seems very, very strange until you begin to drill down, I think, into follow the money as ever. And, a man is not going to see the issues with his stance if his income depends on his not seeing it, or indeed a whole group of people. But let's take a step in then towards the food and farming that is the basis of George Monbiot's book Regenesis, and then is largely the basis of your book saying no to a farm-free future, because farming is your thing. Small Farm Futures is your blog, and it's what you're really focused on. And so let's hone in on your specific topic and your field of expertise, which is farming and food systems and rural life. Because I think you and I both value that. I know if someone herded me into a city, it would be like putting a tiger into a cage. I would pace for a while and then I would just sit down and die. I couldn't do it. And I'm completely aware that some people love living in cities and that's completely fine. But the idea that they're going to pristine wilderness by herding us all into boxes just leaves me extremely unwell. So let's look in more detail at the food and farming system, which is your field, and which is also the basis of Monbiot's Regenesis. And if you could explain a little bit what we believe the proposal to be, other than my meta-analysis of gloop in stainless steel tanks, which doesn't sound appetizing and probably isn't what they have in mind. And then let's look more deeply at what the alternatives might be. First of all, why it doesn't work in your view, and then how we could do things better that would solve not only the problem they've identified, but the broader problems.
Okay, so a big focus of the Regenesis book and of this kind of new drive in eco-modernism is so-called precision fermentation, which I think is a bit of a PR term. I try and avoid using it. I use the term manufactured food, which is a bit more vague. But the technique essentially...
let's see what it is, because precision fermentation does sound very shiny 21st century. It's got that sense of gene splicing and it's technological, so it must be good. And fermentation, everybody knows fermentation is good. There's a whole kefir and kimchi. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I think there's an element of kind of scienciness plus wholesomeness, is a sort of winning formula, but yeah, I mean the basic method is to take a bacterium that originated in the soil. It's a hydrogen oxidizing bacterium that kind of lives on the margins of a kind of aerobic and anaerobic environment in the soil. So you basically feed it hydrogen, which it oxidizes and grows. And so basically the manufactured food technique is to grow this bacterial culture in a stainless steel bioreactor, and you end up with a big load of bacterial biomass, which is very high in protein. And that is the basis of food manufacture. Now we can talk about the rights and wrongs of that. Sorry, yes.
No, it's fine. I just wanted to ask about what are the inputs, because I listened to a Nate Hagen's podcast a little while ago with somebody who sounded like he knew what he was talking about, saying there are no 7 colors of hydrogen. All hydrogen is black. And that means
Right.
all hydrogen has a huge energy cost. And some of it also has an emissions cost. So if I've understood, we take our little friendly bacterium, we feed it hydrogen and oxygen from the air, I guess. And then it multiplies itself, and then we eat it because it's going to taste nice. And
right.
Let's look at actually
that's
the
exactly
nutritional
right.
value
That's
later.
exactly right. Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily that friendly a bacterium, so that's one set of issues to that. I'm not a kind of nutritional expert, but yeah, it's high in nucleic acids and endotoxins, and so there's a lot of questions about how you get to the final product. But that's,
and what are the outflows?
Leaving that aside.
So you have a potential feedstock that is hugely energy intensive, then you might have toxic outflows. Yay.
Yeah, I mean, toxic to humans anyway. So that's something that has to be addressed, and arguably
they'll just
can
put
be.
them into the sea.
I mean,
everything goes in the sea eventually.
I mean,
I read the other day they found
with
microplastics at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. It's terrifying.
Oh, right.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. But I think the key point is the one you made about the hydrogen. So you have to feed it hydrogen. The reason why a lot of eco-modernists are excited about this is because potentially it has less land take than traditional forms of farming, which is maybe something we can talk about. Farming uses sunlight. Sunlight is a free, zero carbon input, but it's diffuse. And therefore, that's why most people have lived rurally through history, because we have to spread out in order to harness the sun. So, the advantage of this technique from that kind of eco-modernist, let's all live in cities and let's leave nature alone viewpoint, is that we can produce food on a lower land area. The problem with it is that you have to feed these bioreactors a bunch of stuff. And as you said, the most important thing is hydrogen. Where do you get the hydrogen from? 99% of hydrogen nowadays comes from fossil fuels. If we're pushing this as a kind of environmentally friendly technique, it can't come from fossil fuels. It has to come basically by electrolyzing water. In order to do that, you need a lot of electricity. So where do we get low carbon electricity from? Well, we can get it from nuclear power. We can get it from renewables, but it's
from the sun. This amazing diffuse power source.
Well, I mean, that's exactly right. If you look at a plant and its leaves, or you look at solar panels, and I mean, I talk about solar panels quite a bit in the book, because I think solar electricity is emerging as the most promising form of renewable electricity, but it's quite land intensive in itself. You need a lot of panels. Now, you need less panels than if we were growing this protein through traditional farming methods. But obviously the panels, it's a hugely, it's a high-tech industrial process that takes a lot of energy itself and produces ultimately a lot of junk that has to be recycled. But I mean, the key point, it does depend a lot on your view about energy futures. I know there are some people who kind of think we're on the cusp of this revolution where we're going to be producing all this cheap renewable energy. But you have to bear in mind that with this so-called precision fermentation, what we're going to have to do is decarbonize all of the existing energy systems. So, all of the industry, all of the transport, all of the manufacturing. And then on top of that, instead of using the sun to energize farming, we're going to have to be using additional electricity to produce all this food. And, I try and crunch the numbers as best I can. And it's hard, actually, because there's a lot of articles boosting this whole technique that don't really talk about the energy. You have to do quite a bit of detective work to get behind the energy figures. But yeah, to my mind, it's basically a non-starter energetically. I mean, if we were going to feed all the protein, or still more, if we're trying to feed all the calories to people, we would have to use kind of orders of magnitude more electricity than we have available presently. So I think it's a non-starter on energetic grounds, and that's not really been figured into the debate. And obviously there are industries, there's this huge pressure on all industries to decarbonize, but there are industries like steel making, for example, where, there's not very many options to decarbonize steel making other than, using electricity, sort of high voltage kind of arc production of steel, for example. Whereas with farming or food production, there is another option, using the sun. So, my argument is, if we've got this zero carbon source of energy that we can use in a key industry, namely food production, we should be using it, because, we're going to have a big enough job decarbonizing the rest of it without overloading it with, another high energy use. So anyway, that's my little energy rant over. I think there was another part to your question.
Let's carry on with where we're going, because I was very struck in your book by your analysis of the numbers. And I think quoting numbers is something that we could get into, but I don't think people need to read the book for the detail. But it seemed to me that the basic maths that had been done on the energy return over energy invested, say, of these proteins and whatever else they want us to eat from the vat, was basically fundamentally wrong. So first of all, it was going to take a lot more energy to produce than they had allowed for. And there was this bizarre idea, exactly as you said, that we're going to have some kind of infinite energy source such that we'll be very happy to put huge amounts of energy. It was something like 25% of the current energy production into producing our food, when in every future world I can look forward to, as in I have the capacity to look forward to, we're going to massively reduce our energy consumption. And then the only bit that makes sense is remembering that there are little tiny solar panels called stalks of grass out there on the hills that are absorbing sun all of the time. And then we have these 4-footed converters that turn cellulose that we can't digest into things that we can, and we can give them a really good life. And the soil can be restored and regenerated while they're doing it. And that seems to be one of the big things that the eco-modernists are missing with their desperate attempt to reduce land surface area. Because Regenesis starts with a very good analysis of why industrial farming is an extraordinarily bad idea. On every possible metric, from animal welfare, it's truly obscene, to the idea that you keep cattle on concrete and then you throw soy that you've grown in Brazil at them, and you walk past and you spray them. You drive past in a great big truck and you spray them with water every 20 minutes because otherwise they die because they're out in the sun in Nevada. And then you feed them antibiotics because otherwise they're going to die anyway. And then we're eating food that has got completely the wrong, say, omega-3, omega-6 balance, amongst lots of other things, is full of antibiotics and growth hormones, and we wonder why we're all very sick. I have recently, I'm halfway through reading Metabolical by Robert Lustig, which is just, I thought I understood about nutrition. And now I'm realizing I don't. And his absolute bottom line is eat real food. And industrially farmed food is not real food. I think we don't take that on board. And its externalities, the huge runoff of nitrates, the huge off-gassing of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, which is a massive greenhouse gas. So all of the reasons why industrial farming is bad are true. But regenerative farming isn't all of those things. And it seems that Mumbio's gone, okay, industrial farming bad, all farming bad. And you have other ways of looking at farming. You've got your 3 categories of farming. Do you want to talk us into why those might not be bad?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we should just go straight into the sort of agroecological or regenerative approach. Or maybe another context, the industrial approach, I think, is essentially, you can cite lots of figures about how terrible modern agriculture is, but it's kind of hard to distinguish it partly from the larger economy and what drives people to do as they do. I mean, there's kind of a lot of finger pointing at farmers, but farmers are essentially responding to the larger economic drivers. So there's a lot of criticisms of the farm system that are actually really criticisms of our society generally. But also farming, is very much a derivative of the fossil energy system. So, you mentioned the production of synthetic fertilizer is a key one. The whole kind of global supply chain and, the kind of transport and traction technologies behind modern farming and the agrochemicals. So, one certainly part of the eco-modernist critique of existing farming is that it's catastrophic for nature, which is correct. That doesn't necessarily have to apply to farming in general. I mean, it is good to leave as much as we can of areas unfarmed, although that kind of has issues as well, because, it depends what happens with the unfarmed areas and what we're expecting to get out of that. But the real onslaught on nature is partly climate change driven by the fossil energy system, and also the extraction of people from the food and farming system, which we've gone for all of these labor-sparing technologies, which ultimately are ecocidal technologies, agrochemicals. You can have a huge field with, one person in a tractor managing it with synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. It produces cheap food. And that leads into another aspect of this, is that we've got this kind of overproduction of essentially grains, cereals and grain legumes, that the whole global modern food system is based on that. And they can be produced cheaply in money terms. But as you say, there's all these externalities that include the onslaught on nature, but also the loss of human communities from farming, the urbanization and going back to that earlier part of our conversation, the urbanization we're basically talking about slum dwelling. It's not that kind of, university campus in Seattle way of life. So, we need to thoroughly change that. It's the overproduction of cheap grains, cereals and grain legumes. And that leads to agricultural expansion. So there's a kind of cheapness underlying the whole global farming system. So then farmers or agribusinesses will do whatever they can do to add value. So that might be pouring these grains down the throats of livestock, or increasingly these days producing biofuels, which is a complete disaster in sorts of ways, and expanding the agricultural land take in order to try and sort of keep your head above water in the kind of economic arms race. So, we need to think about it in a completely different way. And the way we need to think about it is communities, small communities feeding themselves. Now, that does have nature impacts potentially, but, there's all sorts of ways in which we can bring nature back into our farmed landscape, much more diverse cropping. And cropping for human needs, there's partly it's a kind of feedback mechanism thing, and particularly if you don't have cheap energy available, you can't just sort of take a big tractor and lay waste to the whole landscape. You're basically in this, you are an ecological protagonist like all the other creatures trying to produce your food. But when you've produced enough food, you stop, you don't try and produce more and cheaper and flood global markets. And you have to be smart about the way you do it. You have to start thinking in terms of dealing with pests by having wild predators of the pests, by building in diversity, and all of that kind of feeds through into a more nature-friendly, a more land-sharing agriculture. And I think one of the problems with the eco-modernist take is essentially, I think Monbiot says somewhere in his book, the problem with intensive agriculture is not the adjective, it's the noun. I mean, he's basically just given up on agriculture in general. And I would say, the word intensive is, has many meanings and can mislead. But I would say the problem with our agriculture is the adjective, fossil fueled, industrial, capitalist driven, whatever the adjectives you want to apply there, it is the modern model of agriculture that is fundamentally problematic. And it's not only agriculture, it's other aspects, road building, urbanization, light pollution in terms of insects and so on. But, agriculture is definitely up there. But yeah, the key point is that what's bad about it is that it's fossil fueled, so it's another, as it were, it's become a kind of a subsidiary of fossil fuel Inc., and that's the problem. And it's it's that economic drive to overproduction that is so problematic. My second rant over.
No, but it's good. I can't remember if it was on your blog or somewhere else, but somebody referred to the two types of capitalism that are intertwined, with carbon capitalism and nitrogen capitalism, and that our farming system is nitrogen capitalism. We are just basically going to give the boys some very big toys to drive around in, and then they can destroy the soil by spraying it with whatever we give them. And again, I think it was in your book, somebody talking about regenerative farming said, yield is vanity, profit is sanity. And I hadn't really got my head around the extent to which the average industrial farmer might have a turnover of, let's say, £500,000 a year. But of that £500,000, 95% is going to the agribusiness companies. And so their actual income at the end of the year, they're working for less than the minimum wage. But because the money is flowing through the bank, and because the numbers look big, and because when they meet up, it's all about, well, how many tons per hectare did you get? They're not realizing that fundamentally they're working very long hours, very hard to keep Monsanto in business. And part of, it seems to me, how they get away with that is that we've all, to an extent, internalized the idea that the only way to feed the world is this industrial agriculture, that we will not, quotes, feed the world. There are poor, starving people somewhere else, but not here, who need to be fed by us using our industrial techniques. And what I really got from your book was the extent to which that myth is not true. Do you want to talk us through a little bit about how other forms of non-industrial agriculture work in other parts of the world where you don't see fields of 100 hectares with a single tractor trundling up and down them all day?
Right. Yeah, I can try and do that. And perhaps, just to build on what you were just saying there, one of the problems is that notion that we need industrial agriculture to feed people has been really iniquitous. I mean, it's actually the other way around, that so much poverty and hunger has been caused by this pursuit of cheap grains that have all sorts of negative consequences. And as you say, a lot of the farmers, the wealthier farmers, the more mechanized farmers in the richer countries or richer farmers, that nobody is really making much money out of agriculture. They're pretty leveraged, but there's this kind of global race to the bottom where more and more production, we flood the market with cheap food commodities that pushes, other farmers, poorer farmers out of business, or pushes them into, basically everyone gets pushed into specialization. And, that's an element of the eco-modernist critique that then becomes problematic is, for example, in the UK, there's production of sheep in the uplands and, debates about whether that's a good thing or not. But the trouble is every region gets forced into monocropping, essentially the one or the handful of products that it has some type of comparative advantage over in the global market. And what we need is for communities wherever they are, and obviously everywhere is different, everywhere has its own climate and history and topography. What we need is for people to be feeding themselves, to be sort of solving, these big global problems that are ultimately going to be solved at the local level by people feeding themselves and furnishing their livelihoods. So, that's what we need to get into, not this kind of global race to the bottom of, whatever the kind of cheapest way of producing food is. So, yeah, an example here, I suppose, I live on this little holding with my wife and a bunch of other people in Somerset, and we produce vegetables is our main thing, but we have a little bit of livestock, not much, and we have a lot of trees. which have all sorts of functions and kind of also have a mind of their own. I sort of planted a bunch of trees, and then nature kind of takes over and says, "Oh, actually, Chris, you shouldn't have planted those trees there. I'm going to do something else with." So it's sort of like that's part of what wildness is. I think is not, that it's kind of the antithesis of eco-modernism. It's like not trying to control all the variables and trying to solve everything, is actually being a protagonist in a world that you're not completely in control of. But obviously, you do want to control it to a degree. You want to produce food. And, the UK, historically, we have imported a lot of fruit and vegetables in recent years because it's labour intensive, basically, and modern farming labour is dear, fossil energy is cheap. And so anything that you can do with fossil energy in rich countries, we've tended to go down that route and then either import cheap labour or import products of cheap labour. So, what we do here is grow vegetables and produce our own subsistence as much as we can on the site. And that brings nature in and it brings people into the site. And those two things are not contradictory. I mean, it's true that if you want to have tigers and wolves and such like, you do need some big wild spaces in the world, but that can be fostered by not overproducing these cheap grains, by people actually producing the food that they need, good whole food locally. Of course, then that has huge implications for social transformation. And I think that's where we get stuck into the eco-modernist narrative. It's like, the idea of deurbanizing, the idea of people having access to small areas of land to produce their food. Then Monbiot, in some of his recent articles, has talked about a bucolic idyll. I mean, that's just the wrong way of thinking about it. It's not about some romantic idea of going back to the past. It's about, solving our livelihood problems from the ground up. But it does require letting go of that kind of modernist mindset that, urban, more energy, more mechanization, more technology is inherently good. So, yeah, and people are figuring this out in all sorts of ways locally. I think that's one of the problems with this whole debate is that, with our sort of short-term modern media mindset, we sort of want people to come on and say, yeah, I've got the answer and it's this, it's precision fermentation or it's nuclear energy, whatever it is. There isn't one answer. There are lots of answers. They're going to be different in different places and different for different people. And so we need to sort of somehow foster a culture of that kind of pluralism and that kind of bottom up creating livelihoods and not necessarily solving problems. I talk about this a bit in the book. It's there are ways that we can address problems socially as well as technologically, and we can't always solve problems, but we can learn to live with them in various ways. So, and that's what you do as a farmer every day. It's not sometimes producing higher yield is good, but often that can come at a cost, and it's about a complex set of trade-offs that you're wrestling with all the time, not some simple solution and, not some simple drive to high yield or low cost or whatever it might be. So that in a nutshell, I suppose, is how I'd answer that.
Yes. And it opens so many avenues to go down because yet again, we get to the idea that this is a systemic issue, that it's being driven by economics of growth. I don't hear any degrowth narrative in any of the eco-modernist tracts. If it's there, and someone listening is an eco-modernist, please tell me about it. But it does seem to be predicated on still producing as much stuff as possible from the smallest possible area. And you wrote in the book, the idea in a nutshell is that to reduce the impact of farming on wildlife, the two main options are either to reduce the area that's farmed, and I would say that's obviously there. Let's build precision fermentation plants and leave the farms and replace it with wildlife habitat, which is land sparing, or else to make farmed areas themselves more wildlife friendly, which is land sharing. And you say best of all, of course, would be to do both at the same time. And you go on to say there are ways to spare land other than increasing yields, and increasing yields doesn't necessarily spare land. And I wonder how we see, you and I, a future 20, 30, 40 years from now where the eco-modernist way hasn't worked because it can't work because there isn't enough stuff. Per Simon Michel, the material flows are not going to allow for precision fermentation vats in every village, or building cities up to being 5, 6, 7 times the size they are now and herding everybody into them. We just can't do that because the stuff isn't there. If the land sharing and sparing altogether comes about, what you're calling the small farm future, how do we encourage more people back to the land? And what does it look like if we do? What are we wearing? What are we eating? How are we living that doesn't feel like we've just switched off the 21st century clock and gone back to medieval Europe?
Right. Well, it's a tricky one. I mean, I think, whichever vision of the future that one espouses these days, I think there's a kind of rough road ahead. There's no, as I was just saying, there are no simple solutions. I mean, I think the way that it plays out at its best is that, and I can see various sort of utopian and dystopian outcomes with all scenarios, but already I think a lot of farmers, for exactly the reason that you were just mentioning, they're so leveraged, there's so many inputs, and, the prices that they get are so poor that a lot of farmers are already kind of stepping off that input intensive treadmill and trying to engage, on a more human scale, more locally, more directly with customers and so on. And meanwhile, a lot of non-farmers are getting interested in food, wanting to grow fruit and veg in their gardens, wanting to have an allotment, getting involved in community gardens and gardening our spaces. And I think, that is the trend that we have to build on. A lot of farmers are getting into kind of stacking enterprises on their farm, so bringing more people back. So, rather than saying, I've got to have bigger fields, bigger tractor, get rid of the hedges, try and win at that game of overproduction that ultimately, as we were saying, they're never going to win at. So it's more a case of downscaling, bringing other people in, I know a lot of other small market growers like us who have got some land, on an existing larger farm. I mean, obviously where that gets tricky is long term. I think the politics of land ownership or access to land, and that is something I think is the debate that we really need to be having now, is how can people access land in a secure way that gives them the ability to produce food locally for themselves in that kind of sort of local feedback mechanisms, and the politics of that I think are going to be tough in a lot of places. But potentially, I think if we, if you have people who are pressing for access to land, and we've got a situation where chemical inputs are becoming manifestly more problematic, higher prices, a lot of farmers are looking for ways, to have better succession on their land and to have more people involved. So, there is the potential for a kind of virtuous circle of people, cost of living crisis, price of food in the shops going up, trying to think about being an ecological protagonist locally, trying to sort of develop, a complex, wise food system locally. If we can find ways to come together and get access to local food and local production and sort of see ourselves as part of the process, then I think there are possibilities. But there's no two ways about it. It's potentially, it's going to be difficult and it's going to involve conflict. But the same is true, of the sort of eco-modernist. Yeah, absolutely. And my fear is that the eco-modernist dystopia is going to be like, well, we need to preserve nature, so we need to get people out of the countryside. So you have essentially, and that's how a lot of urbanization has been fostered historically, is essentially give people no option but to be in the city, and and then you're sort of dependent on all these processes of high energy input, controlling to the nth degree the lives that people lead. And I don't think that's going to work long term. So, we've got to move, I think, towards, smaller scale, more localized systems of livelihood production in which people are protagonists within that and are kind of part of the ecological feedback mechanisms. And, that ultimately involves a politics of access to land, which, we haven't really had in this country for many years because we have been so sold on this kind of urban, high capital, high energy route. But that's going to change whether we like it or not, I think.
Yes, let's look at that. Because reading your previous book and reading around it, the whole of the enclosures, not just in Scotland, but the herding of people into urban areas in England seemed to me a very deliberate process by the holders of capital to make people dependent on the jobs that they wanted them to do. Because if they stayed in the country, they were basically self-sufficient and they could say no to being made to work in a mill and losing their arms or whatever else. Or as somebody once said, what they were offered was coming out of the country where it's dirty, wet and cold. You can live in this nice, clean city, brackets, slum. And you and your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren for 7 or 8 generations are going to die horribly of typhoid. But by the 8th generation, they'll have internal plumbing and central heating. Yay. And that was not the greatest offer in the world. And now we have the eco-modernist idea, which seems to have, amongst its many, many other glitches, the uber glitch that somehow we, the people, are going to retain some kind of control over the food that we're eating. And it's not going to all be in the hands of the capitalists who currently control the industrial food system. And quite how Mombia or anybody else thinks we're going to wrestle that back is a great mystery. And reading Robert Lustig, he says 93% of Americans currently have metabolic disease, which is to say their mitochondria don't work. There are babies being born obese, being born with mitochondria that don't work, and getting fatty liver syndrome, which used to be the purview of the alcoholics in their 60s. And they're getting it now as children because of a food system that offers people cheap and addictive processed food that is killing them. So either this is a very slow technique to get rid of humanity, possible, but I would have thought if you really wanted to get rid of humanity, there are faster ways. Or it's just people who do not give anything at all, just looking to make money, and they're going to continue to do that. Bill Gates has said he thinks he's going to make an awful lot of money out of processed proteins, and guess who is funding The Guardian? And a lot of the eco-modernist movement. Follow the money. So let's look at the politics of access to land, because one of the other things that I heard recently is someone who, so we're going to have to go to Chatham House rules here because I can't say who told me this, but they had been in conversation with, quote, the minister, who I assume to be the current Minister of Agriculture, who said they would be really happy with 40% churn in the farming industry. And that's not small farmers going out of business and other small farmers buying their land. That's small farmers going out of business and friends of the government buying their land and turning it into whatever it is they want to turn it into. 40%.
I mean, I think there's a huge naivety in all of this, and in the kind of urban argument that somehow we're going to be wealthy enough and we're going to have enough energy at our command to keep this whole show on the road. And I mean, this is one of the things that really concerns me about eco-modernism, globally, is that it's, to use an appropriate agricultural metaphor, it's putting all our eggs in one basket and sort of saying, if you think of these huge cities, globally, Mumbai or Mexico City or where, there's a huge amount of energy, to service them, to get the water, to get the food, to get all the materials in, and then to process all the wastes. Now, if you think that, we're going to have this kind of abundant, clean energy future, that's maybe you can entertain that notion. But I think the reality is, I mean, you talked about nitrogen capitalism earlier. That was exactly how, that first phase of urbanization happened. Prior to that, nice book by Carolyn Steele, Hungry City, where, prior to the modern period, you didn't really have big cities apart from the odd colonial one like Rome or then somewhere like London, because you needed to service them from their hinterlands. the modern mega cities, you can't do that. And so with, anyone living in those kind of cities, they're really investing in the notion that there's going to be this smooth and highly energy intensive flow of goods in and wastes out. And that's not going to work energetically and materially, and also geopolitically. If you look at the global centers, you look at all the issues now with sort of Russia and Ukraine, say, and Ukraine as a global breadbasket. I mean, it's incredibly high risk game to sort of think that we can concentrate all these people in these cities and continue servicing them. And there is an ambiguity there in the eco-modernist approach, I think, where they kind of say, people like me have got it all wrong. They're not arguing for urbanization, or at least not forced urbanization. Like, all they want is for people to stop farming in damaging ways, and we can rewild, and there'd be lots of work involved in, looking after hedges and wetlands and so on. And, I think that's naive. I mean, it was the same argument with the enclosures in Britain. There'll be lots of work, building hedges and fences. And I mean, there was for a few years, and then,
we'll ship you all off to Canada because we can.
Exactly. And then we're looking at huge underemployment or unemployment in the countryside, and I think it'll be the same thing. So I also think there's a naivety in the Monbiot's approach to manufactured food, where he sort of views it as kind of like a local cottage industry, with every town or village having its little manufactured food plant. And I think this is an important point, where if you look at manufacturing industry globally, it is inherently monopolistic. I mean, 100 years ago, I think there's a figure, something like 300 different makes of car in France alone, that were all manufactured in these little local garages. I mean, there's not even 300 makes of car globally now. There's a huge industrial tendency towards monopolization, driven by sort of energy and manufacturing economies of scale.
And the accumulation of capital.
And the accumulation of capital, exactly so. Capital seeks the best returns on capital. And it will be the same with manufactured food. And, the point that the eco-modernists make is, well, the food system is already highly corporatized and concentrated. And that's true, but much less so than the manufacturing system, because, it's harder to turn food production and land ownership. It's harder to turn that into a corporate manufacturing style monopoly. I mean, you can't really just have one factory somewhere producing fruit and vegetables, say, but you can
unless
have one factory.
One person owns all the land.
Well, yeah, but there's all sorts of reasons why there has been a tendency towards land concentration and corporatization in the food system. But there's all sorts of countervailing tendencies in a way that isn't really the case with manufacturing industry. So, okay, there's not just one car factory, but how many car factories are there globally? And this is a real danger, I think, with the manufactured food idea, is that, in principle, you can say, oh, well, we need to fight for open source and to keep it local. But I mean, how successful has that fight been in every other dimension of manufacturing industry? Whereas with land access, it is also an unequal fight. I'm not trying to sort of suggest that, there's easy access to land and local food, but much less so. There's if you look around any area, there's gardens, allotments, small farms, people producing food in all sorts of ways. And that's what we need to amplify, that political fight to have access to producing local food. It's much easier to build that on essentially ecological food production than it is on industrial food manufacture.
I want to move to ecological food production and keystone species in a second, but I'm still really interested in how you see the politics of access to land playing out, because current government happy with 40% churn, which is to say essentially land moving up the capital ladder. I can't imagine any other government of any other colour likely to be elected in the UK in the near future changing that. And much as I would like a different political system, I don't know that we've got a huge amount of time to create one. How do you see us regaining our access to our land. I would love it if every village had a zone around it of, I don't know, 10 miles, where everybody within that zone had access to the land, and then villages would grow and people would farm the land, one hopes. Some of them would turn them into motorbike rallying areas, but quite soon that wouldn't happen because we're going to run out of oil. How would we sensibly regain access to the land, and to what extent do you think we would begin to move towards a model of cities exurbanizing, people coming out of the cities to villages because they want to work the land? It seems to me, given the possibility, a lot of people actually enjoy growing stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to sound overly optimistic and sort of present this as something that's going to be easy, but I will try and give my most optimistic version of it, which is kind of along the lines that you said. I mean, the old idea of the green belt was exactly as you said, for towns and villages to have green land around them that could produce food. And it's sort of become this, let's keep people out of the countryside and not have people living there. We need to get out of that mindset of people living in the countryside being inherently a bad thing. I think that will happen, partly because of, as you said, the accumulative nature of the global economy, the fact that more and more people, the old idea of having a sort of career that, you would sort of get gradually more prosperous and your children would be richer than you were, and we're all on this kind of upwards trajectory, that doesn't wash anymore. Young people are under no illusions that they're going to have this lucrative career. So I think they, are quite key in terms of, can't buy land, I can't buy a house, I can't get a steady job, but, I want to have some kind of meaningful existence. Likewise, cost of living crisis, from a sort of top-down government perspective, keeping affordable food in the shops, I think is going to get harder and harder. So I think in one way or another, and hopefully it will be in a sort of positive, manageable way, there will be people moving out of cities looking to, ultimately it's going to happen because it has to happen. As I said earlier, because sunlight is diffuse, we have to be diffuse, and the quicker we can sort of cotton onto that, the better. But the way I can see it potentially working is there's a lot of farmers who are struggling to make things work within the existing system. There will be a lot of people locally within rural and agricultural areas wanting land, wanting to produce food. The ideal is that if those people can come together and create a politics of land access, then the problem is not that we don't have enough land, it's that we don't do the right things on it and don't have the right people on it. You could, of course, get into some kind of landlordist situation in which the existing owners of land are like, great, you want a bit of land? Well, fine, show me the colour of your money. That's where the class politics have to come in. And, we have to have, what some anthropologists call a moral economy of food production and access to land, exactly how the tenure arrangements work out, whether we're talking about commons or individual ownership or renting arrangements, maybe we can get into that level of detail maybe another day. But the key thing is that there is access to land, that there is a moral economy in which people have access to land. But I think that's only going to come from bottom up grassroots pressure, of people making the case we need land. Other countries, obviously, it's much more of a living issue, like in Brazil, for example, the landless workers movement. There's a lot of peasant movements globally where the whole idea of preserving peasant agriculture and having access to land is very much more alive politically than it has been in, rich countries like the UK or the US or Western Europe. But ultimately, I think it's going to be the same battle.
And do you think, sticking to Western Europe, or at least and North America, the westernized, highly industrial world, I'm not seeing a lot of ground up political pressure actually working. The political class seems to be kind of immune to any attempt to sway them from above. Do you think that's breaking down fast enough that we'll be able to create that?
Okay, so now time for my dystopia. I mean, my fear is no. And what we're going to have is potentially a kind of ultra nationalist sort of like, we are in this global emergency. We need to sort of keep our end up in this fight with all these other countries.
Okay, let's not go there. I regret asking this question already.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
I mean, that is what that's why it's so important to get this message out, I think, and so important to critique the eco-modernist approach, because I think the eco-modernist approach, it's sort of well-meaning. It's kind of like, let's try and make a nice lifestyle. Let's try and deal with all these environmental problems and make a nice lifestyle available to as many people. A nice urban lifestyle as available to as many people as possible, but there is a sort of dystopian undercurrent, which is essentially do what you're told, let the policymakers figure this out. And, and given that they won't be able to, where do we go from there? I think somewhere not particularly appealing. And that's why local food systems, local agroecology, kind of local access to land, I'm not saying it's easy, but that's where we have to go, I think.
Okay. So in our last few minutes, I want to read a little bit of your book. We're unlikely to succeed in rewilding farmed landscapes if we don't start rewilding ourselves, not through idle contemplation of nature, but through generating our livelihoods judiciously from our local ecological base, which is what you've been saying all the way along. But you talk towards the end of your book about becoming a good keystone species. And given that we've glitched over the dystopia bit, the idea of becoming a good keystone species seems to me potentially transformative, because it acknowledges we are a keystone species, which I think the almost white supremacist colonialism of the eco-modernists really seems to glitch over. I'm reminded a lot of my discovery that Ansel Adams, who was one of my childhood heroes when I was really into photography, but every single one of his beautiful, beautiful pictures had the unfortunate people who actually lived on the landscape pushed just out of shot.
Right.
And it seems that we ignore the fact that most of North America, the Amazon, the places that we think of as pristine wild wilderness, partly because Ansel Adams' pictures and others like it, were being managed by the people who lived there. They weren't pristine wild. They were humans were part of the landscape as a keystone species. So your idea that what we need in the modern world is not to step back into medieval farming, but to become a good, conscious, self-conscious keystone species strikes me as being a key narrative going forward. So can you tell us more about how you came to that, what it means for you, and how you see it playing out?
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, a keystone species, I think in ecological parlance, just means one that has a disproportionate impact on its environment. And so there's obviously debates about what it all means. But, I think if you think about an animal like an elephant or a beaver, they're kind of habitat engineers. And, obviously there's this whole narrative about reintroducing beavers to Britain, and people are like, it's great, watershed management, it sort of creates wetlands, it manages floods, it brings in other species. But humans are also habitat engineers, and yet we don't seem to be a good keystone species. It's like, it's great people coming in and sort of building cities and industrial farms, that's not so good. So, I guess my question in that part of the book is, I think humans, we can't help but be a keystone species. We have a kind of outsized impact, but can we be a good keystone species like the beaver and not, some sort of, cataclysmic force on nature? And I mean, part of that is kind of what you were alluding to. I think there has been this notion, I mean, maybe we don't want to get too into the depths of it, but the history of ecology was very much this idea of a climax ecological state that if nature is left alone in any particular place, you tend to get a certain type of flora and fauna. So here where I am in southern England, that would be deciduous woodland, for example. But a kind of a newer idea is that there's always disturbance. It may be that if things are left to their own devices, it would tend to something or other. But things never are left to their own devices. There are always agents of disturbance, and keystone species are one key aspect of that. So grazing herbivores, you don't necessarily get forest succession because you have elephants or deer or whatever it might be that have other ideas. Fire is another big one, not a big issue in Britain, although perhaps increasingly so. But, in a lot of parts of the world, fire very much controls the kind of flora that you get. And kind of as you were alluding to, a lot of indigenous peoples worldwide have used fire regimes to create certain kinds of habitats. And my argument is basically, if we do that well, if you engineer the habitat well, then a lot of good, that can produce what we want, food and other items, but also be positive for nature. Disturbance regimens are not intrinsically bad for natural, they might be bad for some creatures, but they're good for other ones. And so, there's the whole sort of balance. But the problem is that we have too much energy available in the system, and we have too many kind of human symbolic systems, of which capital, I think, is the key one. So we have all sorts of ways of kind of uber disturbance. It's not kind of tweaking the local ecosystem to the benefit of the humans that happen to live there, and, that has some wildlife impacts, but is also beneficial to other wildlife. It's kind of, making over the whole world in the image of a kind of modern Western consumer. And, that's not being a good keystone species. That is using energy and using capital badly. And the problem, I think, that I hint at in that part of the book is that both in nature and in human systems, colonialism is basically parasitizing somebody else's ecology and drawing all of that resource from them to the colonial core. And that ultimately is what modernism is. That's why eco-modernism doesn't work, because modernism doesn't work because it's based on that.
The problem is with the noun, not the adjective.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't work because it's a high energy, high capital extractive system. Whereas if you're a kind of keystone species acting as a local protagonist, within a wider ecology that you are, in some sense, Aldo Leopold, pioneering ecologist, has that wonderful phrase, a plain member and citizen of the biotic community. If we think of ourselves in that way, which doesn't mean we shouldn't farm, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't hunt necessarily, or, kill animals or plants or cut down trees. It's where we draw the lines. It's how we draw that into a renewable ecology is the key thing. And, that's where I think we need to go with the keystone species idea.
And what seems to me the big question that comes out of this is, where do we draw our value system and our aims and goals in being a keystone species? Because we assume, I read today that a dung beetle is a keystone species. It's not planning the impact that it has, it's just being a dung beetle. What we've discovered by just being people is that while we're just being people for whom the accumulation of capital is our end goal, we're destroying everything around us. We're not being a good keystone species. I would draw my values, aims, and goals from spiritual practice, but that's not for everybody. How would you help people to draw aims, goals, and values of being a good keystone species? What would you suggest that they do in order to consciously be keystone species?
Well, I think you're exactly right to draw it back to spiritual values. And I think, again, with this modernism term, that's been part of the problem, is that it kind of, the whole notion of the Enlightenment, this sort of idea that everybody before us was unenlightened and now we've seen the light. And, what is modernism? What is enlightenment? It's basically more capital, more energy, more growth, and that's, we need to find an ethic of limits and of incorporation into a wider system. And there are spiritual practices, I think we do need to, I talk a little bit at the very end of the book about distributism that emerged from Catholic social teaching. I'm not saying that that's the only or the right way to go necessarily, but it's interesting that it draws from a kind of pre-modern tradition of which all great religions and, all enduring people have a kind of spiritual orientation to what we are and who we are and what our place in the world is. And I think the great problem with where we are now is that we are the children of an ideology that has essentially scorned that and focused on growth, essentially growth of capital, of energy, of humanity. I don't see there to be any, again, it's, there isn't a kind of eco-modernist style solution where it's like, don't worry, everybody, I've got the answer. Here it is. Here's your spirituality for you. Just unscrew the cap, and there it is. Yeah. I think
or
this
switch
is
on
a
the
long
app
term.
These days.
Yeah, switch on the app. Yeah, sorry, I'm showing my how behind the times I am. Yeah, it's kind of long-term cultural process. I mean, I've read, I think Tyson Yunker Porter, an Australian Aboriginal thinker, Sand Talk is really good in sort of just showing the length of time that this is a kind of long-term cultural project that we need to be part of. But where I would start with it is just that acknowledgement of, as you say, a spiritual practice about limits and also a material practice about livelihood creation. So it's like, I am going to try and produce food or key myself into where I get my food and the other material aspects of my life. I'm going to try and take an interest in that in a way that is aware of limits and is aware of the consequences of it and aware of the ecology that it's part of. I mean, we're starting from a low base and we don't have much time before some of this stuff just explodes in our faces. But at least to start is somewhere, so to be aware of that kind of spiritual context, to be aware that we need to build this long term, we need to figure out access to land, we need to figure out producing food and other material requisites as part of a renewable ecology. We just need to be engaging with this, and the culture will come long term, and all we can do as individuals and as communities is try and feed into that process as constructively as we can.
That felt like a really good place to end, but I've got so many more questions. Okay, we're not going to end just yet. So what I'm hearing from you is that inculcating a land-based spirituality is a long-term project and we don't have much time. I'm wondering, is it your experience? And I don't know, have you had people who were more urban coming to work with you, and do they find a sense of a land-based spirituality? It doesn't have to have a focus even. It can be a kind of agnostic, atheist, land-based spirituality, but just being with the land. Does that give them a more systemic view? I've got 3 S's written down here, which is systems, spiritual, and service. That sense that once you are spending every day with your hands in the soil and being aware of when it rains and of what the water does on the land, does that help a sense of a systems thinking that then begins to bring us more spiritual and then creates that sense? I have a vision of moving beyond universal basic income to universal basic services. And of course, one of the absolute core universal basic services is access to good, actually nutritious, not poisonous food. And that being part of that service becomes part of our aims, goals, and values in life. So that was quite a broad question. But are you finding that if people come onto the land, that they find a connection to the land?
Yes, I think so. And I think the more that you are, it's difficult if you've got someone who just comes for a day or two and it's like, oh, nice trees, what a nice sunny day. The real work is if you're living and breathing it long term and being part of the cycles. But people, I mean, it's funny, this whole sort of notion of bucolic idyls. I mean, I think there is a positive side that we should emphasize. I mean, I try and avoid that because I think, there's so much sort of more kind of hard graft kind of stuff, why we need to embrace being a good keystone species that isn't about, some kind of up in the air sort of idyll. But nevertheless, for when I was younger, for a year or two, I had an office job in London, and nobody ever asked if they could come free and sit on next to me on my desk in an open plan office, whereas so many people want to come and work the land. And I think we need to embrace that and acknowledge that, there is something, that bucolic is not necessarily bad, but there's a lot of hard graft and a lot of thinking and and also being aware, I think, of the fossil fuel basis of modern society. So it's very easy to reach for a fossil fuel solution, whether that's using a machine or using some kind of chemical product. But as soon as you're aware that you're doing that, it immediately kind of keys you into ecological thinking. I mean, the other thing that's stuck in my mind very much there is we have a forest school on our land with qualified forest school teachers who bring kids in from local schools, and often kids who are kind of struggling in the sort of mainstream educational system. And one thing they do is something like picking up. I remember one of them telling me that sometimes you can give some of these kids who've never really never really engaged with nature at all, give them a woodlouse and put it in their hand, and just seeing this other creature with its autonomous existence is absolutely gobsmacking for these kids. And I think it's kind of keying into that wonder and keying into that sense of, I talk in the book about autonomy and community. I think it's kind of important to be able to, see ourselves as autonomous protagonists and take care of ourselves, but to be aware that inherently we are part of a human community and also a much wider non-human community. And yeah, there's endless ways that we can key into that. But I think being in nature, and particularly not, as I say, not just this sort of idle contemplation of going for a nice walk in, like your Ansel Adams sort of example is a great one, not to sort of screen other people out or, the indigenous dwellers out and sort of wander at the mountains, but actually to think, okay, how would I get food in this environment? How do I create a livelihood that doesn't destroy this environment is really important. And I think, even if you've, the starting place is, some herbs on your windowsill or, some veg in your front garden or an allotment, or there's endless ways we can start making ourselves a part of that. We've got, as we say, given the challenges we face and the time frame, it is daunting, but that's where we start. I really do believe so.
Brilliant. Okay, that does feel like a good place to end. Not that I don't have a lot more questions, but we'll come back for a third time at some point in the future, maybe when you've written your next book, because you seem very prolific.
Maybe, yeah.
I'm super impressed that you managed to farm and write at the same time. So, Chris, is there any last words that you wanted to say, or was that a good place for you to end also?
I'm pretty happy with that, yeah, unless there's any particular burning questions that I didn't answer.
No, I think we covered quite a lot of ground, and I think it was really fantastic and useful. In that case, thank you very much for coming on to the Accidental Gods podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And that is it for another week. Enormous thanks to Chris for taking the time to write this book. It was originally going to be a blog or a pamphlet in the kind of 18th century tradition of a few words on why Mr. Mumbio is completely wrong. And instead it turned into this very beautiful, incisive, thoughtful look at why Mr. Mumbio is entirely wrong, but also how we could live that is better. I really don't want to live in concrete boxes with headsets on, cruising a metaverse while my body turns into a blob, fed with yet another product of the industrial food system, every single product of which has so far made us very, very sick. There is no processed food that is good to eat, and quite why anybody thinks that growing protein in a vat and missing out all of the other things that we have evolved to need is going to be a good thing. This is beyond me. It can't be. It's a logical fallacy, as well as being spiritually utterly destructive. So, thank you to Chris for delving into Mumbio's book in ways that I could not, because it just does too many bad things to my blood pressure, and for having the critical thinking skills to lay out not only where the logical fallacies are, but also how we could be different and how we could be systemically different, because I hope was clear in our conversation, this is not a single issue problem. We are in the middle of a polycrisis, and fixing one tiny part because it happens to fit the agenda of people who think they're going to make a lot of money from selling us manufactured proteins is not the answer. and can never be. We need to start thinking critically and systemically. And if we can begin to think as a good keystone species, then I think we could have a way forward. Feels good to me. So, have a read of Chris's book. It's out early July. You can pre-order it now. I will put the links to the paperback version, the ebook version, and the audio version read by Chris in the show notes. Head there, order it now. That is your homework for this week, people. And before we go, Chris and I will be at the March's Real Food and Farming Conference at Linley Hall in Shropshire on the 15th of September. Probably discussing some of the things that we covered in this podcast, but more likely, I think, we'll just be talking about regenerative farming and how and why it works and what a small farm future could look like. So if you're in the West Midlands of the UK around the second weekend of September, we would love to see you there. That's our public service announcement over, and we will be back next week as ever with another conversation. Huge thanks to Alan Lawles of Airtight Studios in Manchester for the sound production, to Cara C for the music at the head and foot, to Faith Tilleray for setting up our YouTube channel with huge amounts of work. Faith has moved all of the audios to videos, not videos of me, you will be glad to know, because that would be a deeply unpleasant experience, but stills with an interesting little circle that does weebly things as people talk. It's lovely to look at, and I gather a lot of people listen to podcasts on YouTube. So you can do that. I will put a link in the show notes, although there is also now a link on all of the pages that have been transferred over. So you can go and catch up on past podcasts on YouTube, if that's a thing. Who knows? Anyway, we're trying. Beyond that, thanks to Ann Thomas and Jill Coombs for the transcripts. I've lost track of who's doing what this week. And as always, thank you to you for listening. And if you know of anybody else who wants to know how and why becoming a good keystone species could be the future of humanity, then please do send them this link. And that's it for now. See you next week. Thank you and goodbye.